It was on a bitter morning of January, the breath of London rising in plumes from every horse and grate, when the singular business of Northumberland Heath began. I had called at Baker Street to deliver to my old friend a small medical pamphlet upon the ethics of chloroform which he had requested for reasons that, at the time, appeared purely academic. The coals burned with that steady glow which Mrs. Hudson's thrifty hand never failed to summon from indifferent fuel, and Holmes, cross-legged upon the settee, was engaged in the delicate operation of transferring a speck of ash from his violin case to a small sheet of card by means of a camel hair brush. He glanced up as I entered, the sharp grey eyes bright under the thin hawk-like nose which so many a criminal had learned to dread. "Sit down, Watson," said he, with the quick nod which served him for a welcome when the working part of his mind was otherwise employed. "You come from Kensington, and you have encountered a dog of nervous temperament which took a violent dislike to the smell of your overcoat." "You astonish me," I protested, though accustomed by long practice to his assaults upon my modesty. "I have indeed walked from Kensington, and the park-keeper's terrier barked at me, but how in heaven's name—" He lifted the card so that the light caught the ash upon it. "Your sleeve, my dear fellow." A fine dusting of yellow grit peculiar to the new macadam laid along the west side of the broad walk last week. The Times carried a dull paragraph upon it. "As to the dog, there is a faint smear on your cuff where some creature has pressed a nose. See the pale crescent? The coat carries a lingering trace of the tincture of eucalyptus you used for last month's catarrh. The terrier objected to it. Dogs are critics of odours as you are of prose." I laughed, surrendered my coat to the peg, and was on the point of asking whether he expected a client when a double knock, eager, official, and familiar, rattled the door. Mrs. Hudson's step was followed by the entrance of Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, snow caught in his whiskers and indignation in his eye. "You're abroad early, Lestrade," said Holmes. "Either you have lost a prisoner or found a puzzle." "A puzzle, Mr. Holmes?" returned the little inspector, drawing a folded paper from his breast. "And a cursed cold one, if I may say it." He handed Holmes the telegram. My friend smoothed it upon his knee, and I read over his shoulder. "Urgent matter at Northumberland Heath. Stop. Gentleman found frozen to death under inexplicable circumstances. Stop. No marks of violence, yet suspicion of foul play. Stop. Snow around body undisturbed. Stop. Request your immediate presence. Stop." Lestrade. Holmes's long fingers steepled. "The snow round the body undisturbed. That is worth a cab fare. Tell us what you have." Lestrade took the armchair, rubbing his hands. "A banker by the name of Mr. Clement Harrow, late of Harrow and Blythe, Lombard Street. He kept a small villa at the edge of the heath for quiet and air, according to the housekeeper. Last night he supped alone at 8, dismissed his man at 9, and was seen no more until dawn, when a milk lad raised the alarm. The lad spied something on the heath, white upon white, which proved to be the gentleman lying out in the open. Face blue, eyes open, and as stiff as your poker. No footprints to or from him in the fresh fall, and yet the house was bolted within when the servants rose. No key is missing. I'll not say murder, Mr. Holmes, but I'll swear the thing is not natural." Holmes leaned forward. "You are right not to say murder, Lestrade. Say rather, at present, that nature has been persuaded to lend a hand to art. What of his papers, watch, and purse?" "Untouched. There's more. In the gentleman's pocket we found a note, scrawled in an unsteady hand, with the words 'I die as I dreamed' twice over. No signature, but it's his stationery." Holmes's eyes flickered. "Twice over? Curious. Has he a physician?" "A Dr. Meldrum of Woolwich." Called to the house only 3 days ago over a sleep trouble. The housekeeper says the master had lately been plagued by the most dreadful dreams, woke screaming, swore he had died in his bed, not once but twice, and each time felt the cold rush through his bones. That's her phrase. An imaginative housekeeper, Holmes murmured. And the gentleman's affairs? Lestrade pursed his lips. There's talk of a discreet scandal, a certain spiritualist circle in Bloomsbury, table-rapping and such like, where Mr. Harrow was said to consult a lady medium styling herself Madame Zoiler. The servants also mention a nephew with expectations, one Mr. Edwin Sharp, who was lately denied an advance. Finally, Harrow's partner, Mr. Blythe, seems anxious lest any ill report should touch the bank. Holmes set the card and brush aside and rose with decision. You see, Watson, how the matter grows in interest. Dreams, money, and a lady of the tambour. A trio fit to play any man to his final rest. You say the snow around the body showed no disturbance. How long did it fall? All night from 11, on and off, but a good inch by morning. Yet the body lay in a little hollow, with the drift around it, no track of a human foot within yards. Then either the man descended from above, said Holmes dryly, or else he lay there before the snow began, and the later fall covered every approach save the hollow itself. If, for instance, a wind eddied there, I shall not commit myself until I have smelt the air and tasted the drift. Come, we must not keep Mr. Harrow waiting in his cold bed. In a very few minutes we were clattering through streets powdered to the curb, Holmes wrapped in his old ulster with the collar turned high, his face as eager and austere as a falcon's on the glove. Lestrade, opposite us, read and re-read the note taken from the dead man's pocket, as if its bleak sentence might warm under his gaze. I confess that something in the words affected my own imagination. In my medical practice I had encountered the tyranny of dreams, yet for a healthy gentleman of business to predict his own passing, as I dreamed, twice over, was unusual to the point of the uncanny. You incline to believe the line is his? I said. Holmes tapped the carriage window. The hand will tell us more when we compare it with his ledgers and private letters. The phrasing is odd, neither hysterical nor resigned, but factual. A banker's sentence, brief, chilly, and balanced. Twice over. Why twice, Watson? Because he was subject to recurrent nightmares. Possibly, or because the event itself occurred in some sense in duplicate. You recall the case of the gentleman who drowned without water? That notorious barge affair? Certainly. Then you will concede that in this wicked city an effect may be manufactured by indirect means, and that the thing resembling death may be induced twice, the second time to finish the work of the first. He smiled at Lestrade's involuntary shudder. Come, Inspector, you are not new to my philosophy. We do not accept the impossible until we have dismembered the improbable. We crossed the river, the wind knifing us on the open road toward the low rise of the heath. The country lay blank and glimmering, with hedges like black teeth, and here and there the spire of a church pricking the grey. At the footpath a constable saluted and led us by a wicket into the little villa, where the chill seemed scarcely less than without, for though the kitchen fire was high, the passage was a tunnel of stone. The housekeeper, a compact woman with reddened hands and the composed air of one who believes the world is mainly work and hot water, received us in the morning room. If you please, gentlemen, the inspector asked me to say how it happened. I took in the tray at 9 last night. Mr. Harrow bade me good night, cheerful enough, though he had been quiet for days. This morning, when I rose at 6, the milk lad came hammering that there was a body on the heath. I woke the man, Thomas, and we found the parlour window unlatched from within, though the shutters were barred. The front door was bolted and chained. It's a mystery as would turn anyone's hair. Holmes listened with that courteous gravity which, with women of her sort, seldom failed to draw clear recollection. "You say Mr. Harrow had been quiet. Did he speak of his dreams?" She crossed herself. "Twice he did, sir. Woke the house 2 nights running, crying that he was dead, and could feel the winter in him. 'I have died twice in my sleep, Mrs. Pratt,' says he, 'and the second time I knew the first had been no dream.' Then he begged Thomas to fetch laudanum from Dr. Meldrum, but the doctor would not give it. Holmes's nostrils widened a shade. 'Laudanum refused. That was wise. Did any caller seek Mr. Harrow yesterday?' 'Only a gentleman from the bank, Mr. Blythe's clerk, with papers for the master to sign. And late in the afternoon, that nephew, Mr. Sharp. I kept him to the hall, for Mr. Harrow did not wish to see him.' 'Very good. And Madame Zoila?' The woman's mouth tightened. 'We had no fortune-tellers in this house, sir.' Holmes's lip twitched. 'Then your master went to hers.' A quarter of an hour later we followed Lestrade out upon the heath. The wind had stilled. The air hung so still that our breath seemed an impiety against the white silence. The constable led us to a shallow dip at the lee of a gorse clump. There, upon a sheet, stretched stiff as tin, lay the body of Clement Harrow, his features fixed in that calm which is the impudence of death. He wore a heavy coat and muffler. The frost had traced the fur of his collar with a hoar so delicate that it mimicked lace. Holmes did not at once kneel to the man. He stood at the edge of the hollow and surveyed the surrounding snow with an attention that drew Lestrade and me into his stillness. No track marred that field within a dozen yards, save a few wind-stitches where the drift had crept. "You lifted him?" Holmes asked the constable. "Just enough to slide the sheet under, sir." "Quite right not to move more." He beckoned me down. "Observe, Watson, a faint ring in the snow at the level of the shoulders. Do you see it? Not a depression made by weight, but a friable crust, as if something circular rested here and was removed, and the scarf, frozen fast at one edge only. Touch it. No, with your glove. It is stiff, where it ought to be most pliant." He turned then to the face, drawing from his pocket a small lens. "And here is our first true word from the dead. Note the lashes, a minute rim of lamp-black, scarcely visible. Our gentleman visited a house last evening where the lamps are poorly trimmed, or where candles are snuffed with dirty fingers," I suggested, "or where some theatrical grease or blacking is used." "Very good." He sniffed delicately at the muffler. "A trace of anise, not in the man's hair or breath, on the wool. Aniseed lozenges are favourites of singers and of those who would sweeten an unpleasant tincture." "Laudanum, Watson?" "It is commonly disguised so." Holmes straightened, the keen lines of his face sharpening. "We have a circle in the snow, a scarf, frozen at a single seam, a whisper of lamp-black, and an aniseed ghost. Lestrade, before we warm our fingers with argument, take me to Mr. Harrow's writing desk. I should like to see how a banker writes the word twice. Then we shall pay our respects to Dr. Meldrum and to Madame Zoila, who, I fancy, may have dreamed inconveniently often of Mr. Harrow's purse." He glanced once more at the bleak figure in its white cradle. "Come, Watson, the snow has covered our tracks for us, but it has left behind its own." Lestrade led us back toward the house, his boots crunching in the brittle snow. Holmes followed, his gaze roving restlessly over the ground, pausing now and then to stoop for a closer look at some tiny irregularity invisible to my untrained eye. When we re-entered the villa, a dim chill hung in the air, and the faint odour of extinguished candles lingered in the drawing-room, a mingling of wax and smoke that spoke of late-night vigil or nervous pacing. Holmes went directly to a mahogany writing desk in the corner, its surface neatly arranged save for an ink blotter and a single quill lying crosswise upon it. He adjusted his lens and examined the desk with the deliberate care of a surgeon about to make an incision. "The pen has not been used since last night," he murmured. "Note the ink, half dried on the nib, as though the writer had been interrupted. The handwriting on the note you found, Lestrade, it was formed with a trembling hand, yet controlled in spacing. This quill here was held by a steady man, therefore it was not written in terror or under strain. Mr. Harrow did not write those words in his final hour." Lestrade frowned. "Then who did?" Holmes tapped the paper blotter gently, revealing a faint impression beneath the top sheet. He sprinkled a few grains of grey dust from a small tin and passed his lens over it. The letters rose like ghosts in the residue. "Madame Zoyler, Thursday, 8 o'clock sharp." "So," said Holmes quietly, "our gentleman kept his appointments in writing." I could not help observing, "Then he meant to visit the lady last night?" Holmes nodded. "And he did." The trace of lampblack upon his lashes was theatrical powder, common among mediums who darken their surroundings to heighten effect. I believe our banker's last living hours were spent in a parlour thick with incense and superstition. At that moment, the housekeeper, Mrs. Pratt, reappeared in the doorway, twisting her apron. "If you please, gentlemen, Dr. Meldrum has come. He's in the hall." Holmes's eyes brightened. "Excellent. Send him in." A tall, spare man entered, his frock coat buttoned to the chin, his face keen and professionally composed. There was something about his eyes, coldly intelligent but weary, that suggested a man long used to secrets of the body and mind. "Mr. Holmes," said he, inclining his head, "I was Mr. Harrow's physician. I warned him his nerves were perilously strained. He suffered from recurring nightmares of suffocation, with sensations so vivid that he declared himself dead in his sleep. I prescribed rest, abstinence from opiates, and avoidance of psychic circles. Unfortunately, he ignored all three recommendations." "Did you suspect laudanum?" asked Holmes. "Indeed. I found traces of it in his breath upon 2 occasions. He denied its use, but his pupils told another story. It is my belief that his heart may have given way under the strain of repeated self-poisoning. Yet the manner of his discovery, out upon the heath, with every door locked, places the natural explanation under severe strain." "Quite," murmured Holmes. "You say he felt he had died twice in his sleep?" The doctor nodded gravely. "Yes. He claimed that during these attacks he saw himself standing beside his own bed, gazing down at his body. Each time he awakened, convinced that he had truly died and returned. Such experiences, though abnormal, are not unknown among laudanum users. They may arise from narcotic hallucination coupled with cardiac weakness." Holmes's lips curved faintly. "Then his death was in essence the third occurrence of the same dream. Only final." Dr. Meldrum regarded him with professional disapproval. "If you mean he was frightened to death, sir, that is a poet's conclusion, not a physician's." Holmes inclined his head. "And yet," he said softly, "we may discover that a poet's imagination has been put to practical use by someone with less poetry in his soul." When the doctor had gone, Holmes turned sharply to Lestrade. "We must find Madame Zoyler, arrange for a cab, and inquire at her Bloomsbury address. Watson, you will accompany me. I have a feeling this lady's parlour is the true stage upon which our banker met his end." We reached Bloomsbury by noon. The cab halted before a tall, narrow house with lace-curtained windows and a gilt signboard, "Madame Zoyler, clairvoyant and interpreter of dreams." A faint scent of incense drifted from the open door. Holmes mounted the steps, his hat brim low, and knocked. A woman appeared, dark-haired, graceful, and perhaps 40. Her eyes, black and steady, took us in without surprise. "Madame Zoyler?" Holmes inquired. "I am she." "My name is Sherlock Holmes. We are investigating the death of Mr. Clement Harrow." Her expression did not waver, though her fingers tightened upon the silk shawl at her throat. "He came to me last evening. He was troubled by visions, by death seen twice over. I warned him the boundary between dream and waking life is perilous. I begged him to stay until dawn, but he left before the séance was done." "At what hour?" asked Holmes. "Near 10, I think. It was snowing when he departed." Holmes's eyes flickered. "And you saw him to the door yourself?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, I saw him step out. He seemed dazed, as though the spirit had not quite released him. I swear he was alive when he left this house." "Did any other person attend the séance?" "Only my assistant, Miss Varell. She prepared the candles and the incense. You may question her if you wish." Holmes gave a short bow. "I shall presently." He took one step nearer, lowering his voice. "Madame, you use a mixture of oil and blacking for your lamps, do you not?" A flicker of alarm crossed her face. "It aids the shadows." "And aniseed to disguise the odor of certain tinctures?" She froze, lips parting, but no sound came. Holmes smiled thinly. "You will understand, then, why I advise you to remain in London. Mr. Harrow's spirit may soon be less accommodating than you suppose." As we left, I asked him, "Do you think she poisoned him?" "Poison, yes, but not in the common sense," Holmes replied, his eyes gleaming beneath the brim of his hat. "She or another may have played upon his delusions, feeding him draughts that simulated death, only to revive him for further experiment. A man might indeed die twice in a dream if he were made to dream deep enough. Come, Watson, before the day is done, we shall see whether the third dream was his own, or someone else's design." The cab rattled through the wet streets of Bloomsbury, the snow beginning to melt into a grey slush that mirrored the moral grime of the city. Holmes sat deep in thought, his long fingers steepled before his face, eyes unfocused yet burning with some inner light. I knew that look well. It meant that the machinery of his mind was whirring in 1,000 directions at once, testing each possibility with the cold precision of a mathematician. I ventured no question until we reached the end of Great Ormond Street, where he suddenly leaned forward and rapped the roof of the cab. "Stop here, driver," he said. "Watson, we shall walk the remainder. I dislike being observed leaving the house of a lady who traffics in dreams." We alighted, and as we crossed the street, Holmes glanced back toward Madame Zoyler's windows. The lace curtains remained still, but a faint shadow flickered behind them, as though someone were watching. "She is cautious," he murmured, yet her eyes betrayed more than fear. They betrayed calculation. There is more to this woman's art than mere trickery. When we reached the corner, he slowed his stride. "Watson, do you recall the anise scent upon Harrow's scarf?" "Perfectly." "It clings also to that house. I caught it the moment we entered. Laudanum disguised with aniseed is a convenient medium's tool. It induces a trance easily mistaken for communion with the dead. But Harrow's death was no accident. Someone administered a dose so measured that he would sink into catalepsy, the semblance of death perhaps as part of a demonstration. The difficulty lies in how the illusion became reality." "You think the dose was misjudged?" "Or tampered with," Holmes replied. "The hand that mixed it may not have been the same hand that delivered it." Before I could speak further, a shrill voice hailed us from behind. A young woman in a heavy cloak hurried after us, slender, pale, and with eyes that darted nervously. "Please, are you the detectives?" she gasped. "I I am Miss Varel, Madame Zoyle's assistant. I must speak to you before she forbids me. Holmes turned with quiet satisfaction. Then, Providence spares me the trouble of a second visit. Come, Miss Varel, there is a tea-room yonder where we may talk without witnesses. Inside, by the warmth of the coal fire, she clasped her hands upon the table, trembling. I fear something dreadful has happened, sir. I loved Mr. Harrow, not as a client, but truly. He came to Madame for peace, and she used him. She said he was marked by the spirits, that only through her séances could he be spared the death that haunted his dreams. Every week she made him take her elixir before he entered the trance. It was no spirit's work, it was poison. Holmes regarded her steadily. And you are certain of this? I saw her prepare it. Laudanum, yes, but also another liquid from a small green vial. When I questioned her, she said it was spirit essence. But when I smelled it, it was bitter, metallic like copper. Holmes's expression sharpened. Copper, indeed. That would suggest a compound of arsenite, an old trick in spiritual circles to produce faintness and visions. Continue. She made him believe he had died in his sleep, Miss Varel whispered. He would awaken weak, shaking, half believing that his soul had left his body. And then she would tell him the spirits demanded more faith, more money. Last night, when the trance ended, he was deathly pale. I begged her to let me fetch a doctor, but she laughed. Then, after he left, she burned something in the fire, a paper, I think, and locked herself in the séance room until morning. Holmes nodded gravely. You have done well, Miss Varel. Will you swear to repeat this testimony before the law? She hesitated, tears springing to her eyes. I fear her, sir. She has power over people. They obey her as if hypnotized. Holmes's gaze softened slightly. Courage will serve you better than fear. The woman's power lies only in ignorance. Now, one more question. Did Mr. Harrow ever mention a nephew, Mr. Edwin Sharp? Her eyes widened. Yes, he came to the house 3 days ago, furious. Madame told me to admit him secretly. They argued in the parlour. I heard Mr. Sharp accuse her of ruining his uncle's mind. He swore he'd expose her and demanded money, said she owed him for keeping silent. After that, she forbade him the house. Holmes's fingers drummed lightly on the table. Excellent, Miss Varel. You have brought us a step closer to daylight. He rose, leaving a coin upon the saucer. Watson, we return to Baker Street. I must consult my reference on chemical reactions before we visit our young Mr. Sharp. Back in our sitting room the fire burned cheerfully, a contrast to the cold web of deceit Holmes was weaving in his mind. He opened a small volume of toxicology, flipping to a marked page. Listen, Watson, arsenite combined with laudanum produces a curious effect. Temporary paralysis of the voluntary muscles while the heart continues to beat weakly. The subject may appear dead for several hours before breathing ceases, a convenient poison for one who wishes to toy with life and death. You mean Madame Zoyle may have administered this deliberately? Possibly, but her motive alone is not sufficient. If she wished to fleece Harrow, she needed him alive. Someone else profited by his death. Holmes's eyes glinted. And that brings us to the nephew. He reached for his hat once more. Lestrade must be informed that a warrant for Edwin Sharp may soon be useful. But before we act, I wish to see the bank at Lombard Street. Harrow's partner, Mr. Blythe, may enlighten us further, perhaps even reveal whose hands truly held the pen that wrote, "I die as I dreamed," twice over. Outside, the last of the snow was dissolving into mist. The fog rolled low over the Thames as we turned eastward, the lamps glowing dimly through it like dying stars. Holmes walked swiftly, his energy renewed, his voice low and certain beside me. Mark my words, Watson. The man who died twice in a dream was killed neither by spirits nor by sleep, but by someone who understood the exact chemistry of fear and profited from it. The fog along Lombard Street clung to the buildings like a grey shroud, muffling the sound of carriage wheels and footsteps alike. We arrived at the headquarters of Harrow and Blythe shortly after 3. The great banking house loomed solemn and respectable, its brass plate polished to a dull gleam, its windows darkened by heavy drapes that seemed to guard more than ledgers. Holmes paused before the entrance, his eyes narrowing as he studied the signboard. "Reputation, Watson," he murmured, "is often the most fragile currency a banker holds. When one partner dies under mysterious circumstances, the other will guard his good name with desperate zeal or with desperate deceit." Inside, the air smelled faintly of ink, polished wood, and the distant metallic tang of coins being tallied in some back office. A clerk led us to a private chamber where Mr. Blythe awaited us. A portly, nervous man with thinning hair and the complexion of one who seldom ventured into sunlight. He rose from his desk with forced politeness, gesturing toward 2 chairs. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I presume, and Dr. Watson, I had been informed you might call. The news of poor Harrow's death has struck us all most grievously." Holmes inclined his head. "You have my sympathies, Mr. Blythe, but you will understand that my inquiries must sometimes tread where sympathy is unwelcome." "I trust you will answer with candour." The banker swallowed visibly. "I shall do my best. Clement was my partner for 20 years. A cautious man, too cautious perhaps, but upright as any in the city." "Indeed," said Holmes, seating himself. "Yet I gather, not untouched by certain eccentricities, his interest in spiritualism, for example." Blythe's lips tightened. "Yes, that was his weakness. It began 2 years ago after his wife's passing. He found comfort among those charlatans who pretend to converse with the dead. I remonstrated with him to no avail. It was an embarrassment to the firm, though we did our utmost to conceal it." Holmes steepled his fingers. "Did this fascination affect his professional conduct?" The man hesitated. "Only lately he grew distracted, signed papers without reading them, mislaid correspondence. A week before his death, he withdrew a substantial sum, £3,000 in cash. He claimed it was for an investment of a spiritual nature. Whatever that may mean, the money has not been recovered." Holmes's eyes gleamed. £3,000, an expensive séance. Do you know whether any of it was paid to Madame Zoila?" Blythe gave a startled look. "That name has been mentioned. A certain Mr. Edwin Sharp called here yesterday, demanding to see the firm's books. He claimed to be acting on behalf of his late uncle's estate and hinted that the lady might be in possession of funds that rightly belonged to the bank. I refused him, naturally." "Quite so," said Holmes evenly. "But you did not report this attempt to the police?" The banker's fingers twitched. I saw no cause." The young man seemed agitated but not criminal. "I thought grief had unsettled him." Holmes smiled faintly, though his eyes remained cold. "Your compassion does you credit. Tell me, Mr. Blythe, have you preserved Mr. Harrow's correspondence and handwriting samples?" "Every letter since the firm began." "Then, with your permission, I should like to compare a few with a note found upon his person." Blythe opened a drawer and produced a small bundle of envelopes. Holmes examined them quickly, his lens glinting as he compared loops, strokes, and spacing with the fatal message Lestrade had brought. After a long pause, he said quietly, "This gentleman is not the same hand. The note was an imitation, and a poor one. Whoever forged it wished us to believe Harrow anticipated his death." The banker looked visibly shaken. "Good Lord, then someone murdered him?" Holmes rose. Someone certainly profited from his death. May I ask, did you benefit under his will? Only nominally, Blythe stammered. His estate was to pass chiefly to the nephew. I am merely executor. Holmes nodded, his expression unreadable. Executor, an honest but often thankless role. Thank you, Mr. Blythe. I suspect this business will shortly resolve itself. As we left the office, I ventured, You are convinced the note was forged? Beyond question, Holmes replied. The strokes are slower, more deliberate, as though copied by eye rather than instinct. But more telling is the pressure. The writer hesitated at the word twice, pressing harder, as if uncertain of its spacing. Harrow's own letters reveal no such hesitation. Then the forger sought to reinforce the illusion of premonition. Precisely, and who would most benefit from such a theatrical detail? Not the woman who supplied the poison. Her trade thrives on mystery, not on scandal, but the heir, Watson, the man who stood to inherit both wealth and sympathy, Edwin Sharp. We took a hansom through the winding lanes toward Bloomsbury once more. The afternoon light was dimming, and the lamps glowed hazily through the fog. Holmes sat forward, his gaze intent on the street ahead. Lestrade will meet us at the nephew's lodgings. I sent word before leaving the bank. If Sharp is innocent, we shall know it by his answers. If guilty, he will betray himself before the hour is out. The young man received us in rooms modestly furnished, but in disorder, papers strewn across a desk, an empty bottle upon the hearth, and the stale odour of spirits hanging in the air. He was pale, sharp-featured, and restless, with eyes that darted from Holmes to Lestrade like those of a trapped animal. "You have no right to come here," he burst out. "I told the police everything. My uncle's death was the doing of that witch, Zoila. She preyed on him, poisoned his mind and his body, for all I know." Holmes's tone was quiet, almost sympathetic. "Your indignation does you credit, Mr. Sharp, and yet your grief seems touched with resentment. You quarrelled with your uncle, did you not?" Sharp flushed. "Yes, I asked him for an advance, my own money as it would soon have been, but he refused me, said I lacked discipline. He called me a disappointment. I left in anger, but I would not harm him." Holmes regarded him steadily. "Then how do you account for the forged note found upon his body?" The colour drained from Sharp's face. "Forged? What do you mean?" Holmes took a small paper from his pocket. "You wrote this, Mr. Sharp. The evidence of the pen is unmistakable." For a heartbeat, silence filled the room. Then Sharp's shoulders sagged. "I copied it," he muttered. "I meant no harm. She told me he would die soon and that the world must see his words. She said it would save his reputation, that people must think he foresaw his fate. I did as she asked. I swear I thought he still lived." "Ah," said Holmes softly. "So the medium dictated his epitaph and the nephew obeyed. You have given me precisely what I needed, Mr. Sharp. The web tightens." He turned to Lestrade, his eyes alight. "Come, Inspector, we return to Madame Zoila, this time not as guests, but as her reckoning." The streets of Bloomsbury were almost deserted when we arrived once more at Madame Zoila's residence. The fog had thickened to a clinging pall, and the yellow gaslights appeared as dull moons swimming in the mist. Holmes alighted first, motioning for Lestrade to follow quietly. "This time," he whispered, "we enter without the courtesy of a knock. The lady trades in darkness. Let us oblige her with it." The inspector grunted assent, and with a discreet pressure of Holmes's hand, the latch yielded. The narrow hallway beyond was steeped in shadow, perfumed with that same mixture of incense and anise which now seemed to me more sinister than ever. A faint glimmer of light came from beneath the door at the far end, the séance room. Holmes raised his hand for silence, then advanced noiselessly, his long coat brushing the walls. We halted before the door. Voices drifted through, low, urgent, unmistakably feminine. "She must be speaking to her assistant," Holmes murmured, and without hesitation he turned the handle. The door swung inward upon a scene that might have belonged to some infernal theatre. The heavy curtains were drawn, the lamps hooded in red glass. At the centre stood Madame Zoila herself, dressed in flowing black, her dark hair unpinned and falling about her shoulders. She was bending over a small brazier from which rose a sickly blue flame. Miss Varell knelt beside her, pale and terrified. On the table near them stood a decanter, half filled with amber liquid, and a glass still warm from recent use. At sight of us, Madame Zoila straightened, her eyes flashing with fury. "How dare you enter unbidden? This is sacred ground." Holmes stepped forward into the light, his expression calm, almost courteous. "Sacred, perhaps, but not immune to mortal law. You are under suspicion of murder, madam, by poison and by deceit." For a moment she stared, then gave a harsh laugh. "Murder? You poor fool! I offered peace to a tormented man. He came of his own will. If his heart failed him, blame his own fears, not me." Lestrade moved toward the table, but Holmes's hand restrained him. "One moment, Inspector. The lady is correct, up to a point. She offered peace, yes, but through a mixture no mortal frame could long endure. This," he pointed to the decanter, "contains laudanum adulterated with arsenite and the residue of anise to mask its odour. Shall I test it?" Her composure wavered. A flicker of alarm crossed her face. "You cannot prove that," she said quickly. "There is no witness. None!" "On the contrary," said Holmes, "your assistant has already told us everything." Miss Varell gave a small cry and sank against the wall, hiding her face. Madame Zoila turned upon her with sudden venom. "You wretched ingrate! After all I gave you, you betray me to these men." Holmes's voice cut through her tirade like a knife. "Enough! You will find threats useless, madam. The poison can be proved chemically, and the forged note bears the nephew's hand, written at your command. Between you both, you constructed a ghostly drama worthy of a penny dreadful. Harrow believed himself the victim of his own nightmares, when in truth he was the victim of yours." Lestrade produced his warrant, reading it aloud in his clipped official tone. Madame Zoila made no attempt to flee. Instead, she drew herself up with a strange dignity, her dark eyes glimmering like wet stone. "You speak of truth, Mr. Holmes," she said quietly, "but you know nothing of it. You think me a deceiver? Perhaps I am, but the veil between life and death is thinner than you believe. I did not kill him. He called death to himself. I only showed him the way." Holmes regarded her steadily. "An eloquent defense, but not one the law will accept. You administered a dose calculated to simulate death. You meant to revive him at dawn and complete the illusion of his dreams, but the final draft was stronger than you intended, or perhaps it was exchanged." Her lips parted slightly. "Exchanged? By your accomplice," said Holmes softly. "The one who forged the note? He feared you would profit alone, and decided to take both revenge and inheritance in a single stroke. You handed him the means when you let him into your confidence." At that, her composure crumbled. She clutched the edge of the table, her voice hoarse. He swore he only wished to protect his uncle's name. Yet he prepared the fatal mixture while you prepared your incantations," Holmes said coldly. "When Harrow departed, he carried death in his veins and the snow did the rest. You were as much his victim as his murderer." Lestrade stepped forward, snapping the cuffs upon her wrists. She did not resist. Instead, she turned her gaze toward Holmes, her expression strangely mournful. You think yourself so wise, Mr. Holmes, but there are forces even your reason cannot master. When the dead dream, they sometimes dream twice. Holmes inclined his head slightly. If so, madam, I trust your dreams in Holloway jail will be brief. She was led away, her shawl dragging along the carpet, leaving behind the faintest trace of that perfumed smoke. Miss Farrell remained motionless until the last footstep faded. Then she turned to Holmes, tears streaming silently down her face. She was wicked, but she saved me from the streets. I never thought it would end like this. Holmes's expression softened for a moment. Few who tamper with illusion can escape being consumed by it. Take my advice, Miss Farrell. Leave London. Begin anew somewhere far from these shadows. When we stepped outside, the fog had thickened into a damp veil that glowed faintly in the lamplight. Lestrade's figure vanished ahead of us, escorting his prisoner to the waiting cab. Holmes paused on the pavement, gazing upward into the swirling mist. There is one piece still missing, he murmured. I looked at him in surprise. You have the woman, the poison, and the motive. What remains? The letter, Watson, he said slowly. Why was it necessary to forge the note at all? If Sharp meant only to incriminate Zola, why stage his uncle's prophecy? There is something beyond greed here, something theatrical. He wished to shape not merely a death, but a legend. He turned sharply, his eyes glinting in the dim light. Come, my dear fellow. The night is young and Mr. Edwin Sharp is not yet in custody. Let us see whether the man who dreamed of wealth has now awakened to justice. We found Edwin Sharp at his rooms shortly after 9 that night. The police had not yet reached him, for Holmes had sent Lestrade ahead to secure the warrants, but kept us back, explaining in that calm way of his that timing, not force, often loosened a criminal's tongue. The fog had grown so thick that the gas lamps flickered like pale moons through dirty glass, and the street outside his lodgings lay deserted, save for the rattle of a passing hansom. Holmes's cane tapped softly upon the stair as we ascended. From behind the door of the upper chamber came the faint scrape of a chair, and then a rustle of papers hastily gathered. Holmes nodded once, rapped lightly, and entered without waiting for permission. The room was much as we had left it earlier, but something in the atmosphere had changed. An air of desperation now hung over it, as though its occupant had been pacing in torment. Sharp was at the desk, his coat thrown aside, his face pale and strained. Upon the table lay a heap of letters, an open valise, and a revolver whose barrel caught the light like a cold eye. He started at our entrance, then attempted to compose himself. You again, Mr. Holmes? I thought our interview was finished. On the contrary, said Holmes, closing the door behind him. It has merely entered its final act. I advise you to put down that revolver. The play ends better without unnecessary tragedy. Sharp's hand hovered uncertainly, then fell away from the weapon. You've taken her, haven't you? He said hoarsely. Zoila, the witch. She's told you everything. Holmes inclined his head. Enough to see the outline of your collaboration, yes. You forged your uncle's note at her bidding, but you failed to mention that you also exchanged the vials in her cabinet. The mixture she intended to simulate death, you rendered fatal. It was a clever alteration, just enough arsenite to silence him forever. The young man's breath came sharply. That's a lie? Holmes moved to the desk, his eyes glancing over the letters. A lie easily disproved. I see you have been busy tonight. Packing to leave, perhaps? These letters, to a shipping agent at Tilbury. Passage for one to Antwerp under the name E. St. Clair. You would have done well to burn them before our arrival. Sharp sank into the chair, burying his face in his hands. For a moment, There was only the muffled ticking of the mantel clock and the faint hiss of the gas. When he looked up again, all defiance had gone from his eyes. They were hollow, almost childlike in their exhaustion. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "I didn't mean to kill him. I only wanted to frighten him, to end that madness. He was giving her everything, throwing away the business, the family name, our future. She had him under some spell. I thought if he believed himself truly dead once more, he would break from her when he awoke." Holmes's expression did not change, but his voice softened a degree. "Then you admit that you altered the draft?" Sharp hesitated, then gave a small, broken nod. "Yes, I poured a few drops from another bottle into hers. It was supposed to deepen the sleep, nothing more. She said it was harmless. I swear it." "Another bottle?" Holmes repeated. "From where did you obtain it?" "From the chemist on Drury Lane. It was hers originally, Zoyler's. She used to send me for supplies when she wanted secrecy. The label read, Solution B, Spirit of Rest." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Ah, Spirit of Rest. How poetically lethal. You see, Watson, even poisoners love a flourish." He turned back to Sharp. "You were both fools. She toyed with forces she barely comprehended, and you imagined you could outwit her. Between you, you succeeded only in fulfilling the very prophecy you sought to disprove." The young man's shoulders slumped. "Then it's over." "Yes," said Holmes quietly. "For your uncle, it ended upon the heath. For you, it ends at Newgate." A knock sounded from below. Lestrade's men at last. Holmes opened the door and called them up. Sharp rose unsteadily, his face ashen, and allowed himself to be led away without resistance. When the sound of their footsteps had faded down the stair, Holmes crossed to the window. The fog pressed thick against the panes, distorting the lamplight into a dull orange glow. He stood there for a long while in silence. At last I said, "You're thinking of the uncle?" "Of both men," he replied. "The one who died twice in a dream, and the one who dreamed too long of revenge. Each believed himself master of fate, yet both were victims of their own imagination. It is a curious case, Watson, murder, born not of passion, but of delusion." We returned to Baker Street through streets that seemed unnaturally still. Holmes spoke little until we reached our familiar hearth, where the fire had dwindled to embers. He poured himself a measure of brandy and settled into his chair. "Observe, Watson, how the criminal mind bends itself to its own undoing. Sharp might have gained wealth by simple fraud, yet he chose the path of melodrama. He could not resist making his uncle's death a performance, as though the stage required an audience, even in crime. You think vanity guided him?" "Vanity and fear. He wished to prove himself cleverer than the woman who had deceived him. Yet in striking at her, he struck the final blow for her cause. There is irony enough in that to fill a Greek tragedy." He paused, studying the smoke curling from his glass. "You see now why I said the letter troubled me. It was not a mere forgery. It was the script of a play. Every word chosen to suggest fate rather than guilt, death rather than murder. The audience, the public, would read it as the fulfillment of a prophecy. And so, in a manner, they have. I nodded, feeling the weight of it. What will become of Miss Varell? She will give evidence at the trial then, I hope, take my advice and vanish from this city. London has too many ghosts for her already." He leaned back, the faintest shadow of weariness crossing his features. "And now, my dear Watson, if you will indulge me, I shall take refuge in a little sleep. One dream only, and I trust without repetition. I smiled at his dry tone, though the night's events still pressed heavily upon me. As I set down my notes of the case, the last image that lingered was of the heath under snow. The banker lying peacefully upon its white bed, and Holmes's lean figure bending above him, seeking truth in the silence where dreams and death had met. The following morning broke bleak and windless, the grey of the sky merging almost indistinguishably with the roofs of Baker Street. Holmes rose earlier than was his custom, his manner brisk, but his eyes heavy with thought. He stood at the window for a long while, his dressing gown drawn tightly about him, the morning paper unopened upon the table. I knew that look. The case, though solved to the satisfaction of the law, had left something within him unsettled. Without turning, he said quietly, "You slept soundly, I hope, Watson?" "Soundly enough," I replied, "though I confess the image of that poor fellow haunts me still. A man dying in the snow, dreaming that he had already died. It is a grotesque poetry." Holmes gave a slight nod. "Grotesque indeed, and yet curiously symmetrical. Death often arranges its own artistry, but I wonder, my dear fellow, if we have yet glimpsed the entire canvas." I looked up, startled. "You suspect something more?" He turned then, his keen eyes clear and sharp again. "The apparent completeness of this affair troubles me. Zoyler and Sharp have each played their part to perfection, yet one string in the composition remains untuned, the financial one. £3,000 withdrawn and vanished. That sum is unaccounted for, and you will recall that Sharp never mentioned it during his confession." I frowned. "You think another accomplice?" "Perhaps not an accomplice," Holmes mused, pacing before the hearth, "but an inheritor of circumstance. There are ripples in every pond, Watson. A stone falls and the first circle draws the eye, but the wider rings travel further, unseen, until they touch some distant shore." He paused abruptly, reached for the morning paper, and spread it across the table. His finger tapped a small notice near the bottom of the second column. "Observe, mysterious death in Kentish town. Woman found lifeless in her rooms, believed to be suicide by poison. The name, though given as Mrs. Zoe Lambert, is familiar under another form, Madame Zoyler." I rose in astonishment. "Dead? But she was in custody." "She was released under watch until formal charges could be laid," Holmes said grimly. "Evidently, she has chosen the coward's exit. The report states that she swallowed a draught of laudanum, irony's own hand at work. I had expected this outcome, though not so swiftly." He folded the paper with a sigh. "And yet her death simplifies nothing. It complicates. The £3,000 were not found among her effects, nor did Sharp mention any hidden hoard. Someone else possesses that money." He crossed to his writing desk and began to search among his files. From a drawer, he drew a folded sheet, one of Harrow's bank ledgers that Blythe had permitted him to examine. He spread it flat and studied the entries with rapid eyes. "Here, Watson, on the day of the withdrawal, note the notation, Special Commission, ZL, but beneath it, faintly erased, another set of initials, ES. Sharp himself authorized the transaction under his uncle's sign. This is forgery number 2. The banker's death merely covered the earlier theft." I leaned closer. "Then his confession—" "Conveniently incomplete," said Holmes. "He admitted enough to secure sympathy, not enough to secure truth. The boy played for leniency, yet even in the dock, greed outlives remorse." A sharp knock interrupted us. Mrs. Hudson entered, flustered. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes. Says it's urgent." "Name of Blythe." "Show him in," Holmes said swiftly. The banker entered looking haggard and strained, his composure shattered. "Mr. Holmes, I come to you in despair. There has been a burglary at my office. The safe in which Mr. Harrow's private documents were kept was forced during the night. The only thing missing, a sealed packet marked Harrow Estate. I fear it contained securities of great value. Holmes's gaze sharpened. When was this discovered? This morning at 8. The watchman swears the door was locked when he left at midnight. There is no sign of entry from outside. Holmes's lips curved slightly. No sign of entry, no noise, and yet the packet gone. Then the thief possessed a key. Tell me, who else besides yourself and Harrow had access to that safe? Blythe hesitated. No one, save young Sharp, perhaps? He once managed our ledgers before his quarrel with his uncle. Precisely, murmured Holmes. The pattern closes. You see, Watson, the dream continues beyond the grave. Our man who died twice now lives a third time in the imagination of his nephew. While we mourned him, Sharp was still playing his part. The banker looked bewildered, but Sharp is in custody. For the moment, said Holmes, and under a single charge. The law may soon discover he had other rehearsals prepared. We must act before the curtain falls altogether. He seized his coat and hat, motioning me to follow. Within the hour, we were again at Scotland Yard. Lestrade met us at the gate, his expression grim. You're too late, Mr. Holmes. Sharp's gone. Escaped half an hour ago. Holmes's jaw tightened. How? Feigned illness in the cell. The doctor came, left his bag unattended, and the fellow struck him with it. Took his coat and slipped out in the confusion. We've posted men at every station, but the fog's thick as treacle tonight. He could be halfway to the docks by now. Holmes's eyes darkened, but his voice remained calm. He will not leave England. There remains one debt unpaid, the £3,000. The man who kills for gain cannot rest until he touches the coin. We drove at once to Tilbury, the wind cutting sharp through the mist. The docks were alive with restless movement, crates, stevedores, and the mournful sound of foghorns echoing over the Thames. Holmes moved with purpose, questioning guards and ticket clerks, his keen gaze missing nothing. At last, near the second pier, a sailor pointed toward a solitary figure hurrying toward the gangway of a steamer bound for Antwerp. Holmes's hand fell on my arm. There, Watson, the final scene. We ran. Sharp had reached the plank when Holmes's voice rang out, calm, commanding, unmistakable. Mr. Edwin Sharp, you will not need that passage. Your uncle's dreams are waiting to be settled. Sharp froze, his shoulders stiffening. For a heartbeat, he seemed poised to leap into the river, but then his strength broke. The valise slipped from his hand and burst open on the dock, spilling its contents, the crisp gleam of banknotes fluttering into the night wind. He turned, his face hollow in the lantern light. He never left me, you know, he whispered. Every night I saw him, standing beside the bed, as if waiting for me to wake. Holmes's voice was low but firm. You dream too long, Mr. Sharp. It is time to awaken. He did not resist when the constables came. The last I saw of him was that haunted face vanishing into the fog, and the scattered notes drifting away like pale ghosts upon the river's dark surface. Holmes stood watching until they were gone, then turned to me with a weary smile. There, Watson, the man who died twice in a dream, and a third time in his own conscience, a case to remind us that even the clearest logic must sometimes bow to the strange justice of the human soul. The wind off the Thames was bitter that night, carrying with it the damp scent of salt and coal smoke as the last of the constables led Edwin Sharp away. Holmes stood motionless on the dockside, his face half lit by the yellow glare of the lanterns, his breath curling in the cold air. For a long while, neither of us spoke. The fog, like a living thing, swirled about our feet and muffled every sound but the slow lap of water against the wooden piles. When at last Holmes turned to me, his expression was not one of triumph, but of profound weariness. "Come, Watson," he said, quietly. "The play is done, but I confess the ending leaves me curiously unsatisfied. There is a chord in this composition that has not yet been struck." We found a cab and rode back toward Baker Street through nearly deserted streets. The gas lamps glowed faintly through the fog like watchful eyes, and the horses' hooves clattered hollowly upon the cobblestones. Holmes sat in silence, his gaze fixed upon the shifting blur of lights beyond the window. I could tell by the distant gleam in his eyes that his thoughts were working still, restless as the tide. When at last we reached home, Mrs. Hudson had prepared a fire, though it burned low and fitful. Holmes threw himself into his chair and drew the violin case to his knee, but instead of opening it, he stared at it absently. "Strange, is it not, Watson?" he murmured, "how a man's dreams may become the stage upon which his ruin is performed. Harrow dreamt himself dead. His nephew dreamt himself cleverer than both victim and villain. In the end, each found reality no kinder than his imagination." I poured 2 brandies and handed him one. "You've solved many darker cases, Holmes, yet this one troubles you." He smiled faintly. "Because, my dear fellow, it is not over, or rather, it ends too neatly. Consider, the forgery, the poison, the flight, all these fit together, yet one question refuses to be laid to rest. Who first conceived the notion that Harrow had died in his dreams? Who planted that idea in his mind so firmly that he feared his own sleep?" "Surely, Zoila," I said, "she preyed on his weakness and made him believe the visions were real." "Perhaps," said Holmes, but recall Miss Farrell's statement. Harrow spoke of these dreams before he met the woman. It was his physician, Dr. Meldrum, who prescribed laudanum to calm his nerves. The dreams began after that. I have been too ready to accept the doctor's account of his patient's decline. I should like to hear his version again, under less comfortable circumstances. I stared at him in surprise. "You think the doctor was involved?" "I think," said Holmes, rising abruptly, "that a man who controls both the patient's medicine and his imagination controls the man himself. Let us pay Dr. Meldrum a visit before dawn." The wind had strengthened by the time we reached Woolwich, carrying sleet that cut like tiny knives. The doctor's house stood in a narrow lane off the High Street, a dark, narrow building with its shutters drawn. A faint light glowed in an upper window. Holmes tried the door, found it bolted, and rapped sharply with his cane. After a pause, footsteps sounded within, and the door opened a few inches. Meldrum appeared in his dressing gown, his sharp face drawn, and his eyes wary. "Mr. Holmes, what brings you at this hour?" Holmes regarded him coolly. "A matter of unfinished business. You were Mr. Harrow's physician. I must ask whether you also supplied the compound." Madame Zoila called her elixir. The doctor's mouth tightened. "Certainly not. My prescriptions were legitimate, mild laudanum only, as any man might take for rest. You are suggesting—" "I suggest nothing," Holmes interrupted. "I state a fact. The bottle recovered from Zoila's cabinet bore your chemist's label. Moreover, its preparation required access to arsenite, a restricted substance not sold without a physician's order." For a moment, Meldrum's mask slipped. A flicker of panic crossed his face. "Impossible! Someone must have forged my name." Holmes's gaze was relentless. "You are quick to assume forgery, Doctor, perhaps because it has served your purpose before. You knew of Harrow's trust in you. You also knew his obsession with his dreams. You spoke to him of death in sleep, of cataleptic seizures, and you gave him doses sufficient to produce that very condition. He came to believe that he had died twice. When Zoila appeared, you saw your opportunity to rid yourself of a troublesome patient and profit from his death. The doctor's composure shattered. "You cannot prove that," he cried. Holmes's voice was like ice. "On the contrary, the chemist will prove it for me. He recorded the purchase of arsenite under your signature. I found the note among the ledgers this afternoon while you were being summoned as a witness for the inquest. Scotland Yard will receive it within the hour." Meldrum staggered back a pace, his hand groping for the table. "You don't understand," he whispered. "He was doomed already. His heart was weak. I merely hastened what nature would have done within the year." Holmes's expression hardened. "And took £3,000 to console yourself for the service, no doubt." The doctor's eyes widened. How did you know?" "The money was withdrawn under Sharp's hand, but delivered by yours. You received it in trust for the séance circle. Your invention, not Zoiler's. You hid behind her shadow, supplied her potions, and let superstition cloak your science. When she grew dangerous, you arranged her release and sent her the very draft that ended her life. Poetic justice, Doctor, though somewhat premature." The man gave a strangled cry and lunged toward the desk. Holmes was faster. In one motion, he struck aside the drawer the doctor had reached for and drew out a small pistol lying within. "Ah," said he, "so even physicians keep remedies for conscience. I will spare you that prescription." Within the hour, Meldrum was in custody, his confession extracted not by force but by the quiet inevitability of Holmes's reasoning. When at last we returned to Baker Street, dawn was breaking pale and cold over the roofs of London. The first light touched the fog like a fading ghost. Holmes sank into his chair once more, the faintest gleam of satisfaction returning to his eyes. "So ends the dream, Watson," he said softly. "Not a tale of spirits, after all, but of a physician who played God and found himself a devil, the nephew, the medium, the doctor, all puppets of greed, fear, and folly, and beneath it all a man too haunted by imagination to know when he woke. The case of the man who died twice is finished at last." I looked at him across the hearth, the firelight glinting in his grey eyes. "And will you sleep now, Holmes?" He smiled faintly, reaching for his violin at last. "Perhaps, my dear Watson, but only once, and without dreams." The pale winter sun had scarcely risen above the rooftops when Holmes stirred from his chair. The violin rested untouched upon his knees, and the last embers in the grate glowed faintly, casting red veins through the ash. The events of the night had left their mark on him. He looked neither triumphant nor weary, but thoughtful, his gaze fixed upon some point far beyond the walls of Baker Street. I sat opposite, writing my notes, when he spoke in that low, reflective tone that always signalled the case had not yet left his mind. "Watson," he said, "does it not strike you that death, like crime, seldom concludes cleanly? The law is content with confession and punishment, but the truth, it extends beyond the gallows, like the echo of a bell long after the churchyard is still." I set down my pen. "You speak of Harrow?" Holmes inclined his head. "Of him, and of what remains unsaid, there is something about this affair that continues to whisper at the edge of reason. We have the doctor's confession, the nephew's guilt, the medium's death, and yet they form too neat a circle. Life is rarely so symmetrical. I cannot silence the feeling that some hand, unseen and patient, drew all these threads together." I frowned. "You think there was another behind them?" He rose abruptly, pacing before the fire. "Not in the usual sense, no puppet master pulling strings, but perhaps a presence that influenced them all. Call it greed, call it fear, call it suggestion. What matters is that each of these people acted as though compelled by something larger than themselves, as though the dream of death had infected them one by one. Harrow died believing his sleep would kill him. Sharp imagined he could master fate, Zoila believed in spirits. Meldrum believed in his science. Each, in his own way, surrendered to illusion. He stopped, turning sharply to face me. And yet, Watson, one illusion remains unexplained. Who first told Harrow that he had died in his dream? I searched my memory. He told his housekeeper so himself. Perhaps the first dream convinced him. Holmes shook his head. Men of business do not so easily succumb to their own imagination. He must have been primed, prepared for the thought. Meldrum supplied the drug, yes, but who supplied the idea? Before I could answer, there came a sharp knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, her manner nervous. "A messenger, Mr. Holmes. Says it's urgent," from the yard. Holmes took the note, tore it open and scanned the contents. His brows lifted a fraction. "Lestrade requests our presence at the mortuary," he said. "Meldrum's body has been found." "Dead?" I exclaimed. He folded the note. "Dead, and under circumstances most peculiar. Come, Watson, the game, it seems, refuses to conclude." The streets were slick with ice as we drove through the half-light of morning. A pale mist hung over the Thames, and the city stirred reluctantly from its slumber. At the mortuary, Lestrade met us with his usual brisk professionalism, though there was unease behind his small eyes. "It's the devil's own tangle, Mr. Holmes," he said as he led us inside. "We had the man in custody, quiet as a lamb. This morning they found him lying dead on the floor of his cell. No mark upon him, no sign of struggle. The key was in the lock, and the warder swears no one entered." Holmes looked down at the body laid out beneath the white sheet. The doctor's features were composed, almost serene, as though he had merely drifted into sleep. Holmes examined the face, the hands, the lips, then bent closer, sniffing faintly near the mouth. His expression hardened. Laudanum again, but no cup, no residue, no trace upon the breath save the faintest sweetness. He did not drink it, he inhaled it. "Inhaled," Lestrade repeated. Holmes nodded. The air in his cell was thick with vapour. The lamp upon his table, did you notice the char at its edge? A trace of powder dusted the rim. Laudanum vaporized by heat becomes a poison when confined in a closed space. Someone introduced it while he slept. Lestrade stared. But who could have done that? The door was locked from the inside. Holmes's eyes glittered. Then it was not done from the door. "Look upward." Following his gaze, we saw it. A narrow grating above the cell meant for ventilation. Around its rim clung a faint, oily residue. Holmes drew out his lens and inspected it closely. Precisely. Someone poured the tincture through this opening, letting the fumes descend upon him. A clever execution, silent, invisible, and poetic in its justice. The doctor dies as he killed, by the breath of his own invention. Lestrade's face paled. Then who, in heaven's name, could have done it? He had no enemies but the ones we already hold. Holmes's gaze darkened. That, Inspector, is what troubles me. The law holds the body of a woman called Zoila Lambert, but who was she, truly? We have never seen a record of her origin, no birth, no kin. A stage name, a false persona created perhaps by someone who needed her. If she lived by illusion, she might have died by it as well. What if the hand that killed the doctor belonged not to the living, but to one who had already been pronounced dead? Lestrade blinked in confusion. "You can't mean—" "I mean," said Holmes coldly, "that the body found in Kentish Town may not have been Zoila's at all. A woman in her employment, Miss Varell perhaps, vanished after the arrest. The face was disfigured by the poison, the features indistinct. What better disguise than death itself?" A chill ran through me. "Then she lives?" "Lives, and exacts her vengeance," Holmes said softly. "She has murdered the doctor and vanished into the city that breeds shadows." She will not be found until she wishes to be." Lestrade cursed under his breath. "We'll search every lodging in London." Holmes shook his head. "You may search, but you will not find. She has learned the final lesson of her trade. That illusion, once perfected, becomes reality. She will change her name again, her face perhaps, and vanish among the living as easily as she did among the dead." We left the mortuary in silence. Outside, the fog was beginning to lift, revealing the first thin gleam of sunlight upon the river. Holmes drew his collar close against the wind and stood watching the water flow eastward. "Do you see, Watson," he said at last, "how the dream persists? Even when reason has ended it, imagination continues the work. The man who died twice has left behind a third ghost, one of guilt, one of vengeance, and one that no police on earth can exorcise." He turned toward me with that rare, melancholy smile I had seen only a few times before. "London will wake, my friend, and think the case concluded. But for those who know its deeper current, it is but another reminder that truth, like fog, is never fully dispelled. It merely drifts out of sight until the next wind rises." The fog had finally lifted by mid-morning, leaving London grey but visible, the city's vastness stretching beneath a cold, metallic sky. The case might have been finished by ordinary reckoning. 3 culprits dead or captured, their guilt recorded, their motives dissected, but I had long since learned that Sherlock Holmes never accepted an ending that left even a sliver of uncertainty in his mind. And though I longed to consign the whole grim affair to memory, I could see from the restless precision of his movements that the matter of the missing woman, Zoila, or whatever name she now carried, still gnawed at him like a tune half-remembered. He stood before the fireplace, the morning paper untouched, a cigarette burning low between his fingers. "You recall, Watson," he said quietly, "how I told you that illusion, once perfected, becomes reality. There is a dangerous truth in that. For most men, illusion is a passing fever, but for some, it becomes the very air they breathe. Zoila Lambert, or whoever she truly was, has made illusion her identity. Such a creature does not vanish, she transforms." I looked up from the notes I had been compiling. "But surely after the murder of Dr. Meldrum she cannot remain in London. The Yard will have her description, every port and lodging-house under watch." Holmes's lips curved in that faint, sardonic smile I knew too well. "My dear Watson, the Yard will search for a woman who no longer exists. Consider, her art was deception, a change of hair, a new name, a shift in accent, and she becomes another shadow among millions. The question then is not where she hides, but what she seeks. Revenge, you see, rarely dies with satisfaction. It feeds upon itself. She has killed the doctor, yes, but does her vendetta end there? I am not certain." A knock came at the door before I could reply. Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram upon a tray. Holmes took it, tore it open, and read in silence. A flicker of something, interest perhaps, or grim amusement, passed across his face. "Ah, just as I feared. A body has been found in the Old Wharf district at Limehouse. Female, about 30, dressed as a dock worker. Cause of death, poison. Lestrade requests my presence." We were at Limehouse within the hour. The morning fog had drifted inland again, mixing with the acrid smoke of the river barges and the sour reek of fish. The constables had cordoned off a narrow alley behind the warehouses. A small crowd pressed forward, murmuring in the strange hush that always accompanies sudden death. The body lay against a stack of crates, the features obscured by grime, the hands calloused and darkened by labour. But it was the eyes, half open, glazed, and strangely serene, that drew Holmes's immediate attention. He knelt beside her, his fingers brushing the stiff collar of the coarse coat. "A disguise of quality," he murmured. "Look, Watson, beneath the soot, powder residue along the jawline, and here a faint trace of rouge beneath the nails. She washed her hands recently, but not thoroughly. Whoever she was, she had not worn this costume long." Lestrade came forward, his boots squelching in the mud. "Found her at dawn, Mr. Holmes. No papers, no purse. But the chemist's analysis came back fast. Arsenic, small dose, self-administered. There's also this." He handed Holmes a folded scrap of paper, sealed with smudged wax. Holmes broke it open and read aloud. "To the one who dreams twice, I have wakened. Let the circle end." For a long moment he said nothing, merely staring down at the words as the fog curled around him. Then he rose slowly. "So she has written her own epilogue. The one who dreams twice. Harrow, of course. She could not bear to outlive the lie she created. And yet, note the phrasing, Watson. I have wakened. Not died, awakened. Even in the act of death she clings to the illusion of deliverance." Lestrade frowned. "Then it is her, you're sure?" Holmes gazed down at the still form, his face unreadable. "As sure as one can be when dealing with ghosts. But identity, Inspector, is a fragile thing. I suspect she died as she lived, in performance. The true woman may have perished long before this body touched the ground." The constables lifted the stretcher and bore her away toward the waiting wagon. Holmes remained where he was, staring after them until they vanished into the mist. Then he turned abruptly. "Come, Watson, there is still one place we must go before this case may be laid to rest." He gave no explanation until our cab turned into Northumberland Heath. The landscape, now stripped of snow, lay bleak and colourless beneath the low sky. The villa stood shuttered and silent, its windows blank as eyes that had seen too much. Holmes dismissed the driver and walked ahead through the brittle grass toward the hollow where we had first found Harrow's body. The thaw had left the ground soft, but the faint depression where he had lain was still visible. Holmes stood there a long while, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed upon the emptiness. "At last," he said softly. "The circle does end. Harrow feared death until he summoned it. Zoila toyed with death until it claimed her. Meldrum used it and was consumed by it, and Sharp, he thought himself clever enough to escape it, but death caught him too in conscience, if not in flesh. Each of them lived within the same dream, believing they could master the thing that masters all men. In the end, they merely rehearsed their own exits." He stooped and drew a gloved hand across the earth. "You see, Watson, how cleanly time erases the footprints of folly. In a few days, even this hollow will be gone. Yet perhaps it is better so. There are cases one prefers not to remember in detail. And yet—" He straightened, the faintest smile touching his lips. "I find myself oddly grateful to the man who died twice. He has reminded me that logic may explain the mechanism of life, but not always its meaning. The dream, after all, belongs to us all." We walked back to the road in silence. As the wind shifted, the faint sound of church bells reached us from some distant parish, carried thin and wavering over the heath. Holmes paused to listen, his eyes far away, and then turned toward the waiting cab. "Come, my dear Watson," he said quietly. "London awaits us, and with it 100 more enigmas that, I trust, will be less haunted by sleep." And as we rode back through the dim afternoon, I could not help but feel that though the case was finished, some part of it would follow Holmes forever. Like the echo of those bells fading into mist, the final toll for the man who died twice in a dream. The fog that had so long haunted our steps over this strange affair seemed at last to lift from Holmes's mind as it had from the city. By the time we returned to Baker Street, the winter sun glimmered faintly through the curtains, and the fire, newly laid by Mrs. Hudson, sent up a thin, cheerful blaze. Holmes stood by the mantel, hands clasped behind him, the faintest smile at the corner of his mouth, a rare sign that his intellect, after long pursuit, had found peace with itself. "It is finished, Watson," he said quietly. "The circle of death and dream is closed at last. The final piece has fallen where it was always meant to rest." I nodded, though a part of me still felt unsettled. "You mean Zoiler's death?" "Zoiler's ending was inevitable," he replied, his tone more reflective than triumphant. Yet her story was not one of mere wickedness. She began as a woman deceived by her own imagination and by the doctor who fed it. Meldrum found in her the perfect vessel, her beauty to lure, her voice to persuade, her ambition to profit. She believed she commanded spirits, when in truth it was he who commanded her. He moulded her superstition into science, using her parlour and her charms as instruments. Without his hand, there would have been no dream, no poison, no death upon the heath. He paused, looking into the fire, and his voice softened. But illusion has a curious way of devouring its creator. When Meldrum sought to master fear, it mastered him. When Zoiler tried to escape guilt, it consumed her. And young Sharp, vanity was his undoing. He fancied himself author of tragedy when he was but a footnote in it. In their separate ways, each dreamed themselves omnipotent, and each awoke to find death waiting. I leaned forward, watching the reflection of the flames in his eyes. And Harrow himself, Holmes, was he merely a victim of their schemes, or of his own mind? Holmes drew deeply upon his cigarette before answering. Both, I think. His fear made him pliable to suggestion. Yet even in his terror he retained one instinct that proved him more human than his destroyers, the desire to understand his own doom. He sought meaning where there was none, and that search, though fatal, was noble. The note found upon him, though forged, spoke a truth its imitator never intended. He did die, as he dreamed, twice over, once in the mind and once in the flesh. Few men are so consistent. He smiled faintly at his own irony, then turned to me with a sudden briskness that always marked the transition from reflection to deduction. "You see now why I could not rest until the final act was played. There was too much artifice left unresolved. Zoiler's supposed death, Meldrum's convenient confession, each was but another illusion within illusion. It was necessary to tear away every mask before one could say the curtain had fallen." I could not help but smile. "And you have torn away more than one, Holmes. Yet, tell me, are you never weary of these endless masquerades of the human soul? Does it not chill you to see how often intellect serves wickedness rather than good?" He looked at me then, his expression unexpectedly gentle. "My dear Watson, to study darkness is not to dwell within it. It is precisely because I see what men are capable of that I cherish the light that remains. If I did not believe in truth, I would not seek it so fiercely." The words lingered between us, carried softly by the crackle of the fire. For a moment, the familiar room seemed touched by something solemn, as though the ghosts of the case, Harrow, Zoiler, Meldrum, Sharp, had paused to listen before fading into whatever silence awaited them. Holmes broke it first, his tone returning to its customary dry composure. "I imagine Lestrade will dine out for a month upon this business. A physician who murders by science, a medium who kills by faith, and a nephew undone by imagination. It has all the makings of a moral sermon. Scotland Yard loves a tidy moral." "And you?" I asked. He shrugged, lighting another cigarette. "I prefer a tidy logic. Yet I confess this case will remain in my memory longer than most, not for its crime, but for its metaphor. Dreams, Watson, those strange provinces of the mind, can slay more surely than bullets. They whisper, they persuade, and they promise escape when they mean only surrender. He turned back to the window then, watching the pale smoke curl upward into the clear sky. But enough of that. The world stirs again. There will be another telegram, another mystery, another mind to untangle. And so while the city wakes, let us put this one to rest. I looked once more at the man beside the fire, the keen eyes, the ascetic face, the restless energy barely contained within his calm, and thought not for the first time that if Holmes ever dreamed, he too would dream twice, once in the pursuit of truth and again in the longing for peace. Outside, the bells of St. Mary's tolled the hour, their sound clear and distant over the awakening streets. Holmes turned toward me with that familiar half-smile that always marked the end of a case. "Come, Watson," he said. "The man who died twice has taught us enough about sleep. Let us be content for once to remain awake." And with that simple sentence, the quiet, final note to a symphony of deception, the case of the man who died twice in a dream passed from mystery into memory, leaving behind not fear, but the faint, lingering wonder of what men see when reason sleeps and the heart begins to dream.